It begins not with the roar of guns, but with silence, the kind of silence that hangs heavy over sealed vaults, barred archives, and whispered recollections that never made it to the history books. For decades, the Second World War has been told as a story of battles, heroes, and grand strategies. Yet in the shadows, concealed by governments east and west, lies another story altogether. A story written in censored files, erased communiques, and half-burnt ledgers buried deep in forgotten warehouses. These are the operations no general mentioned in his memoirs, the agreements no treaty dared acknowledge, and the secrets still branded too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Between the smouldering ruins of Berlin, the frozen forests of Silesia, and the quarantined wastelands of Manchuria, fragments surface, coded messages, survivor testimonies, official stamps, and sudden disappearances that speak louder than the propaganda of victory. Every regime had its skeletons. Germany's vanished convoys, Stalin's shadow exchanges, Himmler's buried labyrinths, and Japan's biological orders that were swallowed by ash and silence. What connects them is not triumph but terror, not glory but secrecy, and above all, the calculated decision to erase history before it could expose the magnitude of what had truly transpired. Tonight, the files are reopened, not for sensation, but for remembrance, and for the unsettling truth that some legacies of war remain buried because their unmasking could unravel trust in every narrative we have been told. This is the story of 4 secrets from the Second World War, still too dangerous to expose. Chapter 1. The Vanished Convoy of Operation Iron Wolf. The Baltic Sea in the winter of 1944 was a graveyard of steel. Ice floes drifted across waters littered with wreckage, shattered hulls, and the bloated bodies of sailors who had perished in silence. Yet within this chaos, one disappearance stood apart, an operation so carefully concealed that even fragments of its existence are scattered like broken code across intelligence files. It was codenamed Operation Iron Wolf. The name appears only in fragments, scratched across Gestapo file No. 17, referenced in a decrypted message held at Bletchley Park, and whispered in survivor testimonies smuggled from East German archives long after the war ended. It was more than a convoy. It was a sealed mission, tasked not with supplies or soldiers, but with cargo branded Reich Priority Red, a classification higher than the V-2 rocket program, higher than the Me-262 jet fighter, higher even than the Reich's atomic experiments. What the cargo was, no official record explains. What happened to it, no official report admits. But the trail, faint and broken, leads to the most disturbing conclusion: that the convoy's destruction was no accident of war, but the deliberate erasure of something never meant to be found. The convoy itself departed from Königsberg in January 1944 under the protection of Kriegsmarine escorts. Reports indicate at least 3 freighters, their manifests falsified as industrial components bound for Stettin. In reality, they carried sealed containers guarded by SS troops under direct orders from the Reich Security Main Office. The weather was bitter, the seas hostile, yet the mission's urgency is evident from the unusual deployment. Not only naval escorts, but Luftwaffe reconnaissance patrols ordered to shadow the route. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley intercepted fragments of Enigma traffic referring to Wilfer in transit. Analysts flagged it as unusual, but the true meaning was lost among thousands of daily decrypts. Only after the convoy's disappearance did these scraps of intelligence become hauntingly significant. Fishermen along the Estonian coast recalled the night when wreckage washed ashore. Not the usual detritus of war, splintered wood and oil slicks, but twisted steel plates, warped as if by immense heat, though no explosions had been reported. Bodies too surfaced. German sailors with eyes blackened and skin blistered in patterns consistent not with drowning, but with chemical or radiation exposure. Soviet coastal patrols collected some of these corpses, filing reports to the NKVD under the header Unexplained Maritime Incident. Those reports, classified and buried until the 1990s, described the bodies in cold clinical detail: hemorrhaging from the ears and nose, teeth shattered as if by vibration, clothing fused to skin. The Soviets suspected some kind of experimental weapon had been aboard, but no wrecks were located at the time. The Baltic depths kept their secrets well. In 1947, under direct orders from Moscow, Soviet divers returned to the suspected site of the sinking. What they found disturbed even hardened veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk. The hulls of two freighters lay split open on the seabed, but their metal was bent and twisted inward, not outward, as though some force had collapsed the steel from within. Divers reported a lingering hum beneath the water, an unnatural vibration that rattled their instruments and gave them severe headaches. Several returned with burns across their skin, despite no fire being present. Radiation was whispered, but the Geiger readings in the reports are suspiciously absent, suggesting deliberate removal. One diver later testified, in a statement seized by the Stasi, that he saw containers still intact, emitting a faint glow in the darkness of the wreck. He was ordered to silence, and shortly afterward, he vanished from the record altogether. British intelligence too pursued the mystery. In files declassified in 1978, a memorandum marked "Most Secret References." Operation Iron Wolf, in connection with German weapons research, recovered under Operation Paperclip. The Americans, obsessed with rocket technology, had little interest in the Baltic incident. But the British seemed deeply unsettled. One analyst warned that whatever had been aboard the convoy represented a line of experimentation not acknowledged at Nuremberg. The wording is cautious, almost evasive, but the implication clear. The Allies knew of projects so disturbing, so destabilizing, that revealing them could fracture the carefully constructed narrative of post-war justice. The testimonies of survivors add yet another chilling layer. Two sailors, both captured by the Soviets and later transferred to East German custody, were interrogated in the early 1950s. Their transcripts, smuggled out by dissidents and only published decades later, describe the containers in unnerving detail. "They were metal, but not like any metal we knew," one sailor explained. "They vibrated. You could feel it through your boots. Guards were ordered to shoot anyone who approached without authorization. We were told they were experimental engines, but engines do not sing like that." Another sailor described one container being loaded in Königsberg under cover of night, surrounded by SS doctors in protective gear. He recalled hearing muffled screams from inside the crate, though this was dismissed as hallucination under duress. The interrogators noted his trembling, his repeated insistence that the cargo was alive. Whether literal or metaphorical, the statement remains unexplained. Speculation has long haunted the missing pages of Operation Iron Wolf. Some suggest it carried nuclear material smuggled from occupied territories, possibly related to the Reich's Uhrenverein project. Others believe it was an attempt to transport biological weapons, experiments linked to the infamous Reich Institute for Virus Research. More disturbing still is the possibility that it was neither, something beyond conventional categories of weaponry, an attempt to harness forces untested, unrecorded, and uncontrollable. Whatever it was, the destruction of the convoy seems too deliberate to dismiss as an accident. The escorts reported no torpedo strikes, no Allied bombings. The ships simply ceased transmitting, as if swallowed whole. The secrecy surrounding Iron Wolf continues to this day. Russian military archives list the operation only under miscellaneous naval anomalies. German post-war documents avoid the subject entirely, as though the convoy never existed. British and American intelligence, when pressed under Freedom of Information requests, produce heavily redacted memoranda filled with blacked-out paragraphs. Even the numbers of the ships involved remain uncertain, their designations erased from Kriegsmarine records. And yet, the wrecks remain, silent on the seabed of the Baltic, their cargo entombed, guarded by water and time. Occasional reports from divers, unofficial whispered, speak of sickness, disorientation, and hallucinations near the site. Polish naval patrols still mark the area as restricted, citing environmental hazards. It is the absence, more than the fragments, that tells the story. Files missing, reports destroyed, names scrubbed from rosters. Every government that touched the trail of Operation Iron Wolf chose silence over disclosure, erasure over revelation. Whatever those ships carried, it was deemed too dangerous not only for the enemy to know, but for history itself to record. The sea keeps its secrets, but archives whisper. And in those whispers, Iron Wolf still prowls the Baltic, its howl unheard, its cargo unseen, but its shadow stretching across decades, a warning unheeded, and a truth still buried beneath the waves. Chapter 2. Stalin's Secret Pact of Prison Shadows. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939, is remembered for its infamous secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. What is less remembered, deliberately forgotten, erased, or denied, is the shadow pact that followed. Hidden within NKVD correspondence, buried in Gestapo memoranda, and hinted at in smuggled testimonies, was a covert understanding that went beyond land and borders. It dealt in human lives. Between 1940 and 1941, before Germany turned on its Soviet partner, trains moved silently through Brest-Litovsk and other border junctions. Not trains filled with coal or armaments, but sealed wagons carrying prisoners, scientists, engineers, dissidents, and resistance leaders. Each side offered what it had captured, bartering men for secrets. The Soviets called it Code Grey. The Germans simply referred to it as special consignments. And in those wagons, chained and gagged, disappeared some of the brightest and most dangerous minds of the age. The exchange system was designed to leave no trace. Prisoners transferred from Soviet camps were stripped of identity, assigned new numbers, and shipped west under SS guard. In return, Gestapo officials delivered their own selections into the hands of NKVD officers. The Soviets, already notorious for their Gulag archipelago, absorbed these new arrivals without record. Entire families of Polish officers, mathematicians, and underground activists vanished, leaving only questions behind. A 1941 NKVD report to Lavrenti Beria referenced technical acquisitions via prisoner channels, a phrase so sterile it masked the grim reality of flesh traded for formulas. German engineers captured on the Eastern Front vanished into Siberian camps, while Soviet specialists seized in occupied Poland surfaced briefly in camps like Sachsenhausen before being swallowed whole by Nazi laboratories. Officially, none of this ever happened, yet fragments of documentation remain like torn edges of a classified map. One of the earliest references comes from a Gestapo memorandum dated November 1940. It describes the transfer of package Grey 17, identified only as a group of Soviet prisoners with knowledge of advanced metallurgy and chemical processes. They were to be delivered at Brest-Litovsk and handed over to Obersturmbannführer Reinhard Gehlen's staff. Gehlen, later head of West Germany's post-war intelligence under American patronage, was already building his network on information extracted from Soviet captives. Meanwhile, Soviet records, later found in partially burned archives in Vilnius, reference the receipt of German detainees skilled in rocketry and aeronautics, classified under research utility. Their destination, the remote camp complexes of Kolyma, where survival was measured in months, not years. Whether these men ever contributed anything of use remains a mystery, but their names disappeared from German rosters entirely. The scale of the exchanges cannot be measured with precision, but survivor testimony suggests hundreds, possibly thousands, were moved in this clandestine barter. A Polish resistance courier, captured near Warsaw and briefly held in Minsk, described overhearing NKVD officers speak of grey trains passing through under special authority. His notes, smuggled to London in 1943, warned that resistance leaders were being traded to the Gestapo in return for scientific value. British intelligence filed his report, but dismissed it as enemy rumour. Only after the war, when fragments of NKVD communications were decrypted, did the chilling accuracy of his account become clear. The darkness of these exchanges was not limited to scientists. Political prisoners, underground organisers, and captured officers were also traded, often for reasons that remain obscure. One chilling case involves the transfer of captured Soviet officers to the Germans in early 1941. Soviet archives, unsealed briefly in the 1990s, reference disposition of prisoner Set 14G. Cross-referencing German camp records shows that, within weeks, individuals from this group were executed at Buchenwald, their deaths recorded as special treatment. Conversely, Gestapo files list the handover of Polish intellectuals, lawyers, journalists, professors to NKVD custody, their trail ending in the forests of Katyn, where mass graves of Polish officers were later discovered. Though Katyn is now acknowledged as a Soviet atrocity, the possibility that some victims reached that fate through German-Soviet cooperation remains one of history's most unsettling implications. What makes the Pact of Prison Shadows even more disturbing is the evidence of knowledge exchange embedded within it. In Soviet intelligence reports, cryptic references appear to data secured via Code Grey. Analysts who studied these files decades later concluded they related to weapons research. Soviet interest in German nerve agents, such as Tabun and sarin, coincides with prisoner transfers of chemists from occupied territories. German interest in Soviet expertise on rocketry and metallurgy mirrors the timing of transfers eastward. In effect, both regimes used human lives as bargaining chips in an underground market of technology, years before the Cold War would make such trades an official practice. Western intelligence agencies stumbled upon traces of these movements after 1945. The CIA, newly formed, obtained microfilms from captured German records that mentioned grey deliveries. Yet the decision was made to suppress disclosure, revealing that both the Soviets and Nazis collaborated at such a grotesque level risked undermining Allied unity, especially at a time when the Nuremberg trials were presenting a carefully curated image of absolute Nazi guilt. To admit that Stalin's NKVD and Hitler's Gestapo shared not only intelligence but prisoners would have raised dangerous questions about the legitimacy of wartime alliances. Thus, the files were sealed, labeled as unverified or operationally irrelevant, and buried deep in archives where they remain, difficult to access even today. The shadows lengthen, further when one considers the role of individual figures. Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's ruthless security chief, personally oversaw aspects of the program, signing off on transfers categorized as high value. On the German side, Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo, corresponded directly with NKVD officials, ensuring secrecy at the highest level. Neither man survived the war in conventional terms. Müller vanished in 1945 without a trace, his fate never conclusively established, while Beria was executed in 1953 after Stalin's death. Both carried to their graves knowledge of the exchanges, knowledge that no tribunal ever unearthed. Their correspondence, partially recovered, is chillingly pragmatic, speaking of prisoners not as men or women, but as assets, packages, and units of research value. For the prisoners themselves, there was no escape, no acknowledgement, no graves with names. Families searched for decades, writing to Red Cross offices, petitioning governments, seeking word of husbands, fathers, or brothers who had vanished into the grey trains. The official responses were silence, denial, or vague references to unrecorded casualties of war. Even when survivors emerged, their voices were suppressed. In 1962, a Soviet defector named Nikolai Grigoriev testified in Western Europe about his work as an NKVD officer escorting German prisoners eastward. His account was discredited by both Soviet and Western officials, the latter unwilling to provoke Moscow during a fragile stage of the Cold War. Grigoriev died in obscurity, his testimony filed away as propaganda despite corroborating evidence that surfaced later. The ethical implications of the Pact of Prison Shadows are staggering. It reveals a level of cynicism and collaboration between two supposedly mortal enemies that undercuts every simplified narrative of the war. For a brief window, Stalin and Hitler did not merely divide land. They exchanged lives, exploiting human beings as bargaining tools in their pursuit of technological and political advantage. The silence of Western powers after the war suggests complicity, or at the very least, a calculated willingness to let truth rot in locked vaults for the sake of political convenience. The fragments we have, memoranda, survivor notes, microfilmed files, are enough to suggest the scale, but not enough to tell the full story. How many were traded? How many breakthroughs in wartime science were built on knowledge extracted from unwilling captives? How many families never knew that their loved ones had been bartered away like contraband? These questions remain unanswered, buried under the weight of secrecy and the passing of time. What we do know is that the Shadow Pact existed, a forbidden agreement sealed in silence, erased from treaties, and denied by every government that touched it. Its ghosts linger in the footnotes of history, in the gaps of archives, and in the quiet forests of Katyn, where the dead still whisper of betrayal. It is called the Pact of Prison Shadows for a reason, not only because it dealt in darkness, but because it was designed to vanish, to leave nothing behind but absence. And yet, absence itself speaks. The missing names, the erased files, the families still searching. They form the negative image of a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. A truth that reveals war not as a conflict of good versus evil, but as a theater where even the victors made choices they could never admit. In the silence of those sealed trains, rattling across the tracks between Berlin and Moscow, lies a story of complicity, cruelty, and collaboration that the world still struggles to face. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Bunkers. beneath Himmler's forest. In the waning years of the Third Reich, as defeat loomed and the Allies closed in from every side, the Nazi state turned inward, digging deep into the soil of Europe. Beneath the pine forests of Lower Silesia, Heinrich Himmler oversaw the excavation of what official records blandly described as fuel depots and supply tunnels. In truth, these were part of Project Nachtwald, the Night Forest Project. Conceived not as mere storage, but as a labyrinth of sealed chambers, reinforced with concrete and steel, some lined with thick layers of lead. On the surface, they were hidden beneath camouflage netting and forest canopy. Underground, they became a subterranean maze stretching for miles, populated by slave laborers who rarely returned to daylight. Himmler envisioned them as vaults of survival, fortresses for secrets too dangerous to risk in the open. The war ended before the full purpose of Nachtwald could be realized, but what was left behind has remained shrouded in suspicion, sealed by governments and wrapped in silence for decades. The construction began in 1943 as the tide of war shifted irrevocably. Allied bombing campaigns devastated German industry, exposing factories and research centers to destruction from the air. Himmler, always obsessed with secrecy and mystical notions of hidden power, demanded that critical projects be moved underground. The organization TOT, the Reich's Engineering Corps, was tasked with the project. Thousands of prisoners, Poles, Jews, Soviet captives, were marched into the forests, forced to dig tunnels by hand and with crude machinery. The work was brutal, collapses were frequent, ventilation poor, and disease rampant. Testimonies from survivors collected after the war describe suffocating darkness, air thick with dust, and the constant crack of SS whips. Many laborers were simply entombed where they fell, their bodies walled into the chambers they had carved. The dimensions of the Nachtwald tunnels far exceeded the needs of fuel storage. Some chambers were designed like vaults, their walls clad in sheets of lead, their doors reinforced beyond any rational requirement for gasoline or munitions. Engineers later speculated that such construction was consistent with shielding against radiation. Others suggested the chambers were intended for experimental weapons, perhaps chemical or biological stockpiles. A Polish resistance courier reported in late 1944 that shipments marked with the Reich's double red eagle, the designation for top secret scientific cargo, were moved into Nachtwald under heavy guard. Whatever was placed inside those vaults was never retrieved. When the Red Army advanced into Lower Silesia in 1945, the SS enacted a scorched earth withdrawal. Explosives detonated across portions of the tunnels, flooding them with groundwater and collapsing key entrances. Soviet combat engineers documented their entry into some outer passages, but their reports, found decades later in GRU archives, describe abrupt halts at sealed steel doors. These doors, welded from the inside, bore inscriptions indicating hazardous apparatus, Reich Security Main Office authorization only. The Soviets did not breach them. Instead, the NKVD classified the site as restricted and ordered all findings sealed under Special Dossier 12B. Local villagers were warned away, barbed wire encircled the forest, and rumors spread of soldiers sickened merely by proximity to certain chambers. Soviet survey teams conducted deeper investigations in 1947 and again in 1951. Their classified notes describe unsettling conditions: sudden drops in temperature within sealed shafts, instruments disrupted by unexplained electromagnetic interference, and instances of soldiers collapsing with nausea and skin lesions. Geiger counters were referenced, though their readings are missing from the surviving documents, suggesting deliberate omission. One engineer, later interrogated by Western intelligence after defecting, described vault doors that sang faintly when struck, vibrating with a low frequency that lingered in the chest. He insisted that what lay behind them was not simply storage, but something alive, something that moved in silence. His testimony was dismissed as delirium, yet the files remain marked as restricted to this day. The Americans were not ignorant of Nachtwald. Through OSS informants embedded in Poland, they received reports of the tunnels as early as 1944. After the war, during Operation Paperclip, American intelligence pressed for access, hoping to recover whatever research or materials had been hidden underground. The Soviets refused. At Yalta and Potsdam, the issue was raised obliquely, but Moscow would not yield control. In private memoranda, US analysts speculated that the Soviets had indeed recovered something, perhaps related to advanced propulsion or radiation-based weapons. No evidence was shared, and the subject faded into classified obscurity, replaced by the escalating nuclear arms race. Polish authorities inherited the site after Stalin's death. For years, the forest remained encircled by military patrols. Officially, the tunnels were unsafe, filled with toxic gases and prone to collapse. Unofficially, locals spoke of lights flickering among the trees at night, of livestock sickening without cause, of soldiers who vanished during routine inspections. In the 1960s, amateur explorers attempted to enter some collapsed sections, only to emerge with burns across their bodies and symptoms resembling radiation sickness. Their accounts were suppressed by the communist regime, yet rumors continued to circulate among villagers, whispers of the humming vaults and the sealed forest. The purpose of Nachtwald remains speculative, but several disturbing theories persist. One suggests that the tunnels were intended as storage for components of Germany's abortive nuclear program. Though evidence indicates the Reich lagged far behind the Allies in atomic development, fragments of research survive that point to experimental reactors constructed under SS oversight. If so, Nachtwald may have housed early attempts at controlled fission, attempts abandoned in disaster, entombed behind sealed doors to prevent contamination. Another theory ties the site to chemical warfare research. Himmler's fascination with occult and esoteric sciences may have extended into experimental toxins or hallucinogens, tested on prisoners and hidden in subterranean vaults. The presence of lead shielding, however, suggests something more than chemical agents, something that emitted a deadly energy long after the war had ended. The psychological impact of Nachtwald cannot be ignored. Survivors of the construction, interviewed decades later, spoke of the tunnels as cursed. One Polish worker recalled hearing screams echoing through the chambers at night, not from fellow laborers, but from deep within sealed vaults. Others described sudden fainting fits, hallucinations of light patterns on the walls, or sensations of being watched in total darkness. Whether these were symptoms of gas leaks, radiation exposure, or something stranger remains uncertain. What is certain is that thousands died in those tunnels, their bodies left unrecorded, their graves unmarked. Nachtwald became both prison and tomb. Western attempts to investigate resurfaced in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Journalists, historians, and treasure hunters descended upon the forest, seeking access to the fabled bunkers. The Polish military, however, maintained strict control, citing safety hazards. Occasional expeditions were permitted into peripheral chambers, revealing only collapsed passages and rusted machinery. Yet deeper sections remain sealed, guarded by warning signs and patrols. Satellite imagery shows anomalies consistent with massive underground structures still intact beneath the forest floor. Whatever lies within remains off-limits, preserved not by secrecy alone, but by the danger of exposure. Today, the forest above Nachtwald is quiet. Pines sway in the wind, concealing beneath their roots a labyrinth that swallowed men, secrets, and perhaps weapons never meant to see the light of day. The bunkers stand as monuments to Himmler's obsession with control, secrecy, and survival beyond defeat. They are forbidden not merely because they are dangerous, but because opening them might unravel truths that would alter our understanding of what the Third Reich attempted in its final desperate years. In the silence of the forest, in the hum beneath the earth, the echoes of Nachtwald remain, a hidden underworld where history was sealed shut, and where the dead still guard what the living are forbidden to know. Chapter 4. The Lost Orders of Tokyo's Unit 731. In the ashes of Manchuria, as Japan's empire collapsed in 1945, there remained a silence more damning than ruins, more haunting than surrender. It was the silence of Unit 731, the infamous Biological Warfare Division under General Shiro Ishii. The world would later know fragments of their atrocities: vivisections without anesthesia, plague bombs dropped on Chinese villages, prisoners frozen alive for research. But what was revealed at war's end was not the whole truth. Hidden in coded cables, burned directives, and sealed American intelligence files lies the darker spectre of a parallel project known only by its code name, Black Chrysanthemum. These were not experiments for laboratories alone, but field tests of warheads designed to deliver plague, anthrax, and cholera on a mass scale, targeting not only Chinese civilians but Soviet troops along the Manchurian front. What became of these orders, who sanctioned them, and why their details were erased from history remain among the most disturbing mysteries of the 20th century. Unit 731's origins stretch back to the early 1930s, when Ishii, a brilliant but fanatical army physician, convinced Japan's high command that biological weapons could tip the balance of war. Harbin, under occupation in Manchuria, became the epicenter. The facility was vast, disguised as a water purification plant. But inside its walls, thousands of human beings, Chinese prisoners, Korean captives, Soviet POWs, and even Allied soldiers, were subjected to experiments of unimaginable cruelty. By the late 1930s, Ishii's teams had perfected the cultivation of plague-infested fleas, anthrax spores, and cholera bacteria. What history books often omit is how far they went in weaponizing these pathogens. The directives for Black Chrysanthemum reveal plans not only for battlefield deployment, but for citywide contamination campaigns designed to paralyze entire populations. One such directive, partially recovered from Japanese archives before being suppressed, describes the preparation of plague bombs to be deployed against advancing Soviet forces in 1945, codenamed Operation Cherry Petal. The plan called for aircraft to disperse ceramic bombs packed with infected fleas over Soviet regiments near the Ussuri River. Soviet military reports confirm that units in this sector suffered sudden outbreaks of mystery fevers in the weeks before Japan's surrender. The deaths were recorded in Red Army medical logs as epidemic casualties. Survivors described comrades who collapsed overnight, with blackened lymph nodes and high fevers, symptoms consistent with bubonic plague. Yet the outbreak was never acknowledged publicly, buried instead in sealed medical archives until the 1990s. American intelligence, aware of the potential goldmine of data contained in Unit 731's research, moved swiftly as the war ended. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, Ishii and his senior staff handed over thousands of pages of experimental data, coded directives, and preserved samples. Operation Paperclip is remembered for bringing German scientists to America, but a parallel, quieter program brought Japan's biological warfare expertise into US hands. The agreement was stark. In return for secrecy and protection, Ishii provided what no Allied laboratory could replicate without unspeakable human cost: first-hand results of biological warfare on human subjects. It was a deal that spat upon the principles of Nuremberg, but was justified in the name of Cold War survival. The lost orders of Black Chrysanthemum are referenced in US Army documents marked Confidential, Far East Command, 1947. Analysts reviewing the material noted discrepancies between the research Ishii surrendered and the outbreaks recorded in Soviet-occupied Manchuria. One memorandum warned that not all operational directives had been accounted for. Another described intercepted Japanese cables mentioning field trials against Red forces, though no such trials were included in the data provided. It was clear that Ishii withheld portions of his program, or that materials were destroyed during the Soviet advance. Yet rumors persisted that certain orders were secretly transferred to American custody, sanitized and reclassified as epidemiological defense studies. If true, the US not only shielded war criminals, but incorporated the very knowledge gained through atrocities into its own bioweapons program at Fort Detrick. Maryland, the Soviets too pursued their share of Unit 731's legacy. Captured staff members who did not reach American lines were tried in Khabarovsk in 1949. A trial dismissed in the West as propaganda. Yet transcripts reveal harrowing details consistent with survivor testimony. Witnesses describe plague releases in Chinese villages such as Ningbo and Kuzhou, where entire populations were decimated. They spoke of special orders issued under the seal of Black Chrysanthemum, authorizing live field tests against unsuspecting civilians. These orders were not presented at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, an omission widely believed to be the result of American intervention. The official narrative focused on lesser crimes, while the most damning directives were quietly erased. Survivors who attempted to speak out were silenced. In the 1950s and 1960s, Chinese villagers who testified about plague bombings were dismissed as victims of natural outbreaks. Soviet soldiers who reported suspicious epidemics were accused of exaggeration or incompetence. Even Japanese doctors who hinted at the existence of black chrysanthemum faced harassment, loss of position, or mysterious deaths. The narrative of Unit 731 became one of partial horror, enough to shock but never complete enough to reveal the scale of the crimes or the complicity of those who benefited from them. The orders remained missing, the directives lost, the accountability buried beneath layers of Cold War necessity. What remains today are fragments, coded telegrams, survivor testimonies, declassified but redacted reports. They form a picture of a program more advanced, more operational than the sanitized version history records. Unit 731 was not merely a research facility, it was a military weapon system tested on living populations. Its lost orders point to campaigns that were carried out but never admitted, epidemics that were engineered but written off as natural, and data that was laundered through Allied laboratories until its origins were untraceable. The truth is scattered across archives in Tokyo, Moscow, Beijing, and Washington, each holding pieces, but none willing to reveal the full design. The legacy of Black Chrysanthemum is not just historical, it is ethical. It forces the question of how far nations will go to suppress the truth in the name of national security. The United States, by shielding Ishii, made a calculated choice to prioritize advantage over justice. The Soviets, by burying their own evidence, chose propaganda over transparency. Japan, by denying and minimizing, preserved national pride at the cost of memory. And caught between them are the victims, tens of thousands of nameless men, women, and children whose suffering was converted into data, whose deaths were filed as operational notes, and whose story remains unfinished. The lost orders of Tokyo's Unit 731 are more than missing documents. They are the silence of archives, the absence of justice, the erasure of accountability. They remind us that the darkest crimes of war are not only those committed, but those concealed. And they warn us that some secrets are kept, not because they are forgotten, but because they are still, even now, too dangerous to expose. It does not end with the files we have reopened, nor with the foreshadows we have traced across the ruins of the Second World War. For every sealed order and vanished convoy, for every buried labyrinth and lost directive, there remain countless others waiting, perhaps forever, in the vaults of intelligence agencies and the margins of redacted reports. What makes these secrets so dangerous is not only what they reveal about the past, but what they say about the present, that nations will bargain with atrocity if it gives them advantage. That truth is negotiable when weighed against power, and that justice can be traded away under the stamp of classified. The ghosts of Stalingrad's hidden tunnels, the Reich's phantom convoys, Stalin's unspoken pacts, and Tokyo's erased directives remind us that the official history of the war was never complete. Instead, it was carefully constructed, shaped by victors and survivors, stitched together by propaganda, and reinforced by silence. To question it is to pull at threads that unravel not only old lies, but the trust we place in every account of conflict since. The danger then lies not in the past itself, but in what happens when suppressed truths emerge in the present. When the secrets once thought buried forever rise to the surface, forcing us to confront the possibility that history is not a closed book, but an open wound. These are the legacies of a war that never truly ended. These are the secrets still too dangerous to expose.